Yes, I am Kay Tappan. I'm a lecturer here in the Department of Public Relations. I heard a fellow professor once say that we're the voice of organizations, and I would go one step further and say we're sort of the personality of an organization. So if you think about how you've communicated with an organization this week, whether you've read a newspaper article that mentioned a museum, or you've gone to see a play and read the playbill, or you've seen a poster for an event coming up, all of those communications were created by public relations professionals or whomever handles the public relations for that organization. So corporate public relations obviously does all the communications for a corporation. So that involves communicating with shareholders, communicating with the media, communicating with consumers. So any sort of person or public who might have a stake in that corporation. So they might be doing investor relations, creating promotional materials, handling the website, and a lot of that they might outsource and work with agencies as well. Whereas an agency actually works on a specific client. So a lot of our students will go into agency right after, and they can actually, if Coca-Cola needs a public relations campaign and you're working in an agency, you might be on the Coca-Cola campaign. So it's much more sort of specific little projects in an agency. Whereas corporate, you might be doing a lot of different things in different departments within one sort of corporation or organization. I think there are so many different jobs you can do with public relations because every organization needs communications. I've sort of seen three general routes that students will take. So a lot of them want to go into the nonprofit world, so they'll go work and do communications for a nonprofit. A lot of volunteer relations, a lot of donor relations, a lot of beneficiary relations, planning events, so that's a big part of public relations, and also the nonprofit world. The second track is to go into agency life, so go work at a smaller boutique firm or Ketchum or Edelman or one of the larger firms, Golan, some of these firms with an international presence. They'll go work for those firms and do work maybe in areas of doing research for a client or creating strategic communications tactics for a client. And then the third route would be corporate communications or in-house. So doing communications functions, but for one organization at one sort of corporation. I think mentorship is critical in any profession, but absolutely it's critical in public relations. And I think that one thing that's so important for public relations students is to do an internship. I believe that it's not required, but we strongly encourage an internship. It's a great way to sort of get your foot in the door, try out whether you like nonprofit, or maybe go do an internship for a corporation or an agency and see if that's for you. And oftentimes through those internships, you'll meet someone, maybe who's higher up than you or the big boss or whomever it may be, who can give you some tips and advice, and someone who you really stay in touch with throughout your education and then beyond. So I actually did some internships when I was doing my master's in communications. And a couple of my bosses at these different internships I'm still in touch with, and I'll send interns to them, or they'll come guest lecture in my class. So, it's sort of creating these lasting relationships. I remember one of my favorite shows is Mad Men, and they had an episode called Public Relations. And it was basically for this client, they created this big publicity scheme where they paid these two actresses to go to a grocery store and pretend they were fighting over the last ham. So the ham company was actually their client. And so the agency, paid these women to pretend that this was actually happening and they're fighting over a ham in order to get media coverage. So the newspaper would write this story about, this was the last ham and people were fighting over it. And I think that's the biggest misconception, is that we're sort of create these stunts to get publicity, to get the media to pay attention to us. Whatever the organization is, if it's a nonprofit or if it's a celebrity or a corporation, we all have communications with our stakeholders. And so I think sort of that media relations publicity stunt is kind of the biggest misconception. I think nowadays, particularly with social media and with digital, organizations can really communicate directly with their stakeholders. So I don't necessarily need the newspaper to write a story about my organization for people to know about it. I have my website, I have my social media presence, I can communicate with them directly. And so there's a much greater level of sort of communication between organizations and stakeholders, and a lot more transparency too as far as social media. I would say wherever you are, you can do an internship, and that might not officially be an internship. If you're in some small town, go to the local dentist office or the local grocery store and say, hey, do you guys have an event coming up? Want me to create some sort of promotion for it? Want me to design an event for you? Get involved however you can. It doesn't necessarily have to be some official, we're in a college town, we offer internships, fill out the form here. you can really get involved in little ways, even if it's your mom's business or your dad's business and you want to start doing communications for them. Just put yourself out there, get involved, come up with something, be creative. And that's, I think, a great way to get experience. And then if you do get sort of a more official internship opportunity, you have something to talk about. So start wherever you can, communicating on behalf of any kind of organization that you know. And then I think also get involved with clubs. So we have club organizations here on campus. And you don't necessarily have to show up to every meeting to be a member. If you pay your dues, they do Twitter chats. They'll have speakers sometimes via Skype or things like that. So you can actually get involved in a club without physically being on campus. First of all, I think public relations is a great field to go into because we can now communicate directly. Almost every single organization needs a communicator. So I think it's a really in-demand profession. I think my greatest advice would be obviously hard work. When you're young and you're new, you kind of have to bust your butt. It's not like, oh, I go home at 5 and I'm done. It's like, oh, I go home when this project's done. That might be the middle of the night. So kind of get used to that fast pace. I think if you love what you're doing, that's not such a burden because you're like, oh, cool, I'm really involved in this project. So be enthusiastic about what you do. Reach out to people, ask for help, ask people what you can do for them, and maintain relationships. So like I said, these internships that I did several years ago where I'm still in touch with my former bosses, I send them interns, they come guest lecture for me. If they need, access to the college, maybe I can invite them to some events. So it's a give and take, right? So create these relationships and then maintain them and be authentic with them.